The Hi-Point 1095 TS 10mm carbine is a complex firearm and one worthy of a full and complete review. Because of such, this review is lengthy and detailed. However, it will be the most complete of any review of this firearm that you will encounter, and, hopefully, the best. I hope that you will travel with me on this path of presenting the Hi-Point 1095 TS carbine. Before I get to the review, let's take a look at 10 reasons regarding why you should own a Hi-Point 1095 TS carbine. Number 10. It is easy to shoot. Being a pistol caliber firearm, and with even shooting the 10mm, recoil is very light, and that appeals to many. Being a semi-automatic firearm, the heavy bolt and recoil pad helps to mitigate recoil so that people of all shapes and sizes can operate it. Number 9. It is an intimidating firearm. While not pretty to look at, as it leans to the tactical side, seeing the Hi-Point 1095 TS in someone's hands just might make the bad guy think twice about doing bad things to you and yours. Number 8. It has a greater maximum effective range than a pistol of the same caliber. The 17.5-inch barrel not only extends the MPBR, or maximum point-blank range, over that of a pistol, but also contributes to an increase in velocity of the selected cartridge. Number 7. The 1095 TS comes with a lifetime warranty, as long as you use only Hi-Point magazines. More on that in the review. Number 6. Ammunition interchangeability. Ammunition can be shared with a pistol or revolver of the same caliber. Number 5. Ammunition cost. For the most part, the 10mm cartridge is on par with other pistol calibers, and even with some popular rifle cartridges, like the 5.56x45 NATO, 223 Remington, and 7.62x39mm. Cost of the 10mm, on average, is slightly more than a 9mm and 45 ACP, but you get a cartridge that exhibits ballistics somewhere in between a .357 Magnum and a .41 Magnum. Number 4. The 1095 TS is made in America, Mansfield, Ohio, as a matter of fact. Number 3. It is accurate. While not a precision firearm, the 1095 TS is as accurate, if not more so, than the person operating it. If the operator does their part, the 1095 TS will deliver in the accuracy department. Number 2. It is reliable. Of the 3 Hi-Point carbines that I own and use factory magazines, I have not yet experienced an FTF, FTE, or other malady. The 1095 TS will feed and shoot any 10mm cartridge you put in it. And number 1. It is an inexpensive firearm. Inexpensive does not mean cheap. It is simply a firearm that is affordable for most. Honestly, I have inexpensive firearms that can operate as well as more expensive firearms of the same type. The quality that you get in a firearm costing under $400, and which chambers a cartridge that has been chosen as the #1 defensive cartridge in Alaska against predators, large and small, and which is normally chambered in a pistol, should prompt you to seriously consider the cost-to-benefit ratio of the Hi-Point 1095 TS carbine. There you have it, my 10 reasons for owning the Hi-Point 1095 TS carbine. Now, let's get to the review. Hi-Point carbines are offered in a variety of calibers from .380 ACP to 10mm, and with many options. Because of my past experience with Hi-Point carbines, I felt no qualms about ordering the 10mm version in basic black, and today I'm going to tell you about it, my experience with it, and what I did to personalize it for my taste. First, let's take a look at the basics. Specifications for the 1095 TS include a barrel length of 17.5 inches. It weighs 7 pounds unloaded. It has a 10+1 shot capacity, an overall length of 32 inches, fully adjustable front and rear sights, and an all-weather black molded polymer stock. Features include a threaded .578 by 28 inch thread barrel with end cap, a thumb magazine release, an all-weather polymer skeletonized stock, a raised soft rubber cheek piece, free trigger lock, sling, and swivels. It is 100% American-made parts and assembled. Internal recoil buffer is in the stock, a 10-round magazine, a flat black receiver shroud, manual thumb safety, fully adjustable sights, rear peep and post front, Picatinny rails, last round lock open. When you purchase any Hi-Point carbine, you will also receive some basic items with your purchase. A multi-tool that is specific to the firearm, an operating rod assembly that consists of the operating rod and roller, sling swivels, metal sling adjuster, and a nylon sling, a magazine intended for the specific cartridge, the instruction sheet with parts breakdown, an accessory list, a magazine warning sheet, and a Hi-Point dual lock with instructions. The multi-tool provides the means to operate the lock and is a separate padlock and required to secure the lock. And finally, a chamber flag. The operating handle assembly must be installed, and a multi-tool provides the means to install it. If you purchase the Hi-Point 1095 TS with any or all of the options, the optional accessories will be included with your purchase. All options will require mounting, and all optics will require zeroing. I am not a metallurgist, an engineer, or an expert in the design of firearms. In fact, I am probably pretty stupid about firearms in general. But that does not mean that I cannot forge an opinion based on what is in front of me, and then pass that opinion on to others who might be interested in the same product. With that said, I will attempt to reach the gun geek in some by voicing my opinion of the overall quality and construction of the Hi-Point 1095 TS. Attempting to mate stock of steel has always been a challenge to firearms manufacturers, regardless of the type of stock and quality of finished steel used. Firearms, in general, have always been modular affairs, lock, stock, and barrel, and that characteristic has been passed to the present and will continue into the future. Longevity of a firearm is established usually through the quality and construction of a firearm, and modern manufactured materials has stretched the lifespan of many firearms, even inexpensive ones. With that said, Failures can occur even in very expensive firearms, and the MTBF, or mean time between failure, is usually determined by the weakest component, excluding the operator. In a lot of cases, and with firearms that use external magazines as a food source, failure of these firearms is largely with the magazines being used. The ammunition, other external source, being used in a firearm can also be a contributing factor in determining a firearm's quality, but unfairly so. Considering the cost to the consumer for the Hi-Point 1095 TS, there is a lot of quality for the money. I have purchased firearms for a lot more money that I have found to be ill-fitted and poorly matched finishes. I have had, on some occasions, to procure the labor of a qualified gunsmith to make things right with a new firearm, and endured the agony of seeing that first scratch on a finish that was supposed to be as durable as any known to man. From my observation, it seems that all parts are fitted nicely and tightly on the 1095 TS. The overall look is somewhat tactical looking due to the tactical stock that Hi-Point has used since changing over to the second generation model, and which is an excellent departure from the first generation. Now, let me provide you with some information about the action. The action is a straight blowback closed bolt firing design and uses a heavy bolt, recoil spring, and double spring firing pin system. The action is a typical striker action, whereas no hammer is present. The operating handle is located on the left side of the receiver, while ejection is out of the right side of the receiver. The Hi-Point 1095 TS features a lockback on last round feature with Hi-Point magazines. After the last round in the magazine is fired, part of the magazine presses upward against a hold-open lever, which is under tension by a hold-open spring. The receiver shroud is 0.065 inch thick stamped metal that has received a flat black finish. The receiver shroud is held securely in place by two spring-loaded captive pins. The receiver shroud also serves as a foundation for a substantial polymer Picatinny sight rail, and depending on your choice of options, a fully adjustable rear sight or optic. The receiver and bolt are die-cast from Zamac 3. If you are interested in just what Zamac 3 is, I have posted a link in the description. The bolt is locked back by the hold-open lever. When the operating handle is pulled rearward, with or without a loaded magazine, taking tension off of the lockback lever, the lockback spring pulls the lockback lever out of the way of the bolt, which allows the bolt to move forward into battery due to the tension of the recoil spring. The breech bolt contains the firing pin springs, and bolt retainer that is held in place by the bolt retainer clip when the breech bolt is assembled to the receiver. The action can be locked back manually by pulling the operating handle fully to the rear and then pushing the operating handle roller inward to lock it into its detent in the receiver shroud. With that said, some effort is required because the bolt is stiff at the end of its rearward travel. Also with that said, I found it easier to insert an empty magazine and then pull the operating handle fully to the rear until it locks in place with a hold-open lever. This is much easier than trying to locate the locking notch without a magazine inserted. The operating handle and roller are attached to the bolt by way of the wrench that is provided with the firearm. The threaded operating handle is pushed through the bolt upon assembly, where it is secured on the opposite side by screw threads. Removing the operating handle is necessary when disassembling the Hi-Point 1095 TS. The tightness of the charging handle might need checking periodically during firing. Hi-Point states in its documentation, do not over-tighten any screws or nuts. Snug is sufficient. Spent shell extraction is via a robust external to the bolt dual claw extractor. Extraction is very positive. The firing pin is a free-floating affair that rides within a channel. Dual firing pin coil springs also float within the firing pin channel. The dual spring-loaded firing pin means that the firing pin will reliably protrude past the bolt face and buffer the firing pin from the impact with the spent primer during recoil, but only for a mere fraction of a second at the end of the recoil. When the bolt is fully rearward locked, the firing pin protrudes approximately 1/8 inch out from the bolt face. The Hi-Point 1095 TS uses the firing pin to eject spent cartridges. While this seems to be a strange way of ejecting spent shells, it seems to be effective. When the bolt begins its forward motion, spring tension is removed from the firing pin and the firing pin floats within the firing pin channel, which prevents the possibility of a slam fire occurring. The trigger assembly is polymer and skeletonized, and the face of the trigger is wide and serrated. Trigger pull weight is in the vicinity of 9.12 pounds. There is very slight take-up before the trigger is engaged. Although the trigger is heavy, the brake is crisp and I could not detect any over travel. Don't expect a quick trigger reset. The reset on this trigger is almost to its front travel limit. To rectify the heavy trigger, the sear spring was replaced with a unit from mcarbo.com. The reduction in trigger pull is amazing. Trigger pull weight went from 9.12 pounds to 5.5 pounds, and this definitely makes a difference during shooting of the firearm. Now, let's quickly explore the safety features. A thumb safety lever is located on the left side of the firearm, just above the hand grip, and should be well within reach of most right-hand shooters. The thumb safety operates in a conventional manner, where down equals fire, the red dot on the receiver cover is visible, and up equals safe. The red dot on the receiver cover is not visible. The thumb safety lever is a slim and lightly textured affair. I have become accustomed to operating the thumb safety on an MSR, but that thumb safety lever is more substantial than the thumb safety with the Hi-Point 1095 TS. The thumb safety, while stiff when new, is easily moved from one position to the other. Note that the thumb safety is part of the barrel receiver fire control group, and the safety lever simply protrudes through the receiver shroud and a small portion at the top of the lower. When the lever is within the receiver shroud, the firearm cannot be fired. To provide additional protection, the design includes a spring-loaded sear block that falls under the sear pin arm and prevents sear movement if the pistol is dropped, while a weight counteracts sear movement. Hi-Point firearms comes with a trigger lock known as the dual lock. The two halves are placed on both sides of the trigger guard of an unloaded firearm and are locked together by means of a spring-loaded shaft turned by a special two-prong key. Additional security can be provided by inserting a customer-provided padlock through a hole on the end of the shaft. Thankfully, Hi-Point has realized that people do not like peeling safety stickers off of their firearms or have them embedded into the firearm, but safety warnings are a necessary evil. Hi-Point has opted to place peel-off safety stickers inside the box lid. You will not find a safety warning on the firearm itself. Thank you, Hi-Point. The Hi-Point 1095 TS uses a 10-round single-stack magazine, and one is provided with the Hi-Point. I thought ahead and ordered 2 additional magazines. The magazine is a steel magazine with a polymer follower. A polymer base extends beyond the magazine well to accommodate insertion and removal of the magazine. The extended polymer magazine base adds about 3/4 of an inch to the grip. The extended magazine base plate can be removed for servicing the magazine. Although Hi-Point offers a kit that allows the attachment of 2 magazines to the stock, I opted not to go for that. And speaking of the stock, let's take stock of the stock. The upper section and forend is very busy. As mentioned earlier, the receiver shroud is held into place by captivated pins and clips, while the forend cover is held into place by a rail lock and friction fitting. The lower forearm is highly textured and has a Picatinny rail on new models for attachments. The upper polymer forend cover does blend well with the receiver shroud and is a skeletonized affair. The forend cover has 4 slots that allow heat from the barrel to escape. The forend cover mates up with 4 slots that are part of the lower forearm. I'll cover the removal and installation of the forend cover in the maintenance chapter of this review. Note that the rail lock locks the top rail to the forend cover and keeps the top rail from flexing while holding the forend cover into place. The butt area of the stock is skeletonized and incorporates a polymer butt pad that bolts onto a buffered bolt-on butt plate. 3 springs provide buffering, although there is not much recoil at all with the Hi-Point 1095 TS. However, the springs may also add a bit of safety if the firearm is dropped on the butt pad, absorbing shock and helping to prevent the firing pin from striking the primer of a live round. A rubber-like insert in the top of the buttstock provides a solid cheek rest. The cheek rest is very, sticky to the touch. The LOP, or length of pull, of the stock is approximately 14.5 inches, and for me, is almost perfect. The stock has a finely pebbled texture, with the exception of the cheek piece and the grip area, which have a texture of their own, and all blend well to make a nice overall appearance. Each side of the grip, at the top, is sculptured to accept the trigger finger and thumb, and the grip is very comfortable. With a grip that accepts a 10-round single-stack magazine, the width of the grip surprised me and is 1.46 inches, where the majority of the hand grips. The grip is mildly textured and provides a good surface for the hand. A single finger groove, and I happen to like finger grooves, provide for quickly locating the hand to the grip. The grip angle and contour feel very pleasing in the hand and has just enough arch to it for the palm of my hand to feel at home. The front and the rear of the grip have horizontal serrations, and the shooting finger and thumb area is a panel of texture different from the other textures. The front end of the stock extends well into the barrel, where you will find an underbarrel rail extension for mounting a light or laser that extends all the way to the front sight. For me, the rail was modified after I removed the front sight to mount an optic, and since there would be nothing to support the rail at the muzzle end. Some precision cutting work with an X-Acto saw removed the rail but left the base, which was needed to ensure that no gap between the lower and the barrel exists. The bottom polymer rail can be removed with a 9/64" Allen head wrench. However, there are polymer guide pins for the rail that are integral to the forearm. Therefore, removing the rail may not be a viable option unless you are willing to do some cleanup work. Normally, I mount a Magpul AFG angled foregrip to the under rail. This time, however, I went in a different direction. A green laser unit from GM-Com was mounted just forward of a folding forward grip from Hi-Point Firearms. I'll get into the green laser unit when I talk about sights and optics. The folding forward grip, which was purchased from Hi-Point Firearms, allows 2 front support variations at a push of a button, a vertical surface of which to hold when folded down, and a horizontal surface when folded back against the stock. And it can be used as a monopod of sorts. In this case, it also has another purpose, and that is to help protect the GM-Com green laser unit. I'll talk about more when we go to the range. The foregrip also has a provision for storing the Hi-Point multi-tool that comes with the firearm. Two 1-inch sling attachments are provided with the Hi-Point 1095 TS, as is a sling. A plunger screw at the rear of the stock and the front stock bolt have to be removed and replaced with a sling swivel bolt to accommodate a sling. That takes care of the stock. Let's talk a bit about the barrel. The 17.5-inch 37/64 by 2 threaded barrel is integrated into the receiver and fire control system and is held into place with a single roll pin. Hi-Point recommends cleaning the barrel every 300 to 400 rounds. I opted for a razor muzzle brake from Hi-Point for a different looking front end, just for tee-hees and giggles. Because of the longer barrel length over a standard pistol, some higher velocity and accuracy can be expected. Well, that covers the lock, stock, and barrel. Now, let's see how we keep the thing pointed in the right direction. The front sight is a two-piece steel unit consisting of a front sight and front sight base that is affixed to the barrel and is in stark contrast to the barrel's finish. Two set screws attach the front sight base to the barrel, and the front sight is held in place to the front sight base by a hex head bolt. The front sight can be removed to accommodate optic-only capabilities while keeping the front sight base in place on the barrel. The sight post is well protected by a shroud and sits above the barrel's bore axis by about 2 1/4 inches. Loosen the front screw slightly to allow the front sight to move up or down within its channel to adjust for elevation. You may have noticed that my 1095 TS does not have a front sight. It was removed to accommodate an optic that I'll talk about in a bit. The rear sight is a fully adjustable peep sight for windage and elevation. Adjustment increments are clearly highlighted with high visibility paint. The rear sight has indicators that help you align the sight for both windage and elevation. The rear sight is fully protected by side rails from damage. The rear sight, as with the front sight, is removable to accommodate optic-only sighting or for mounting a magnified optic that will clear the front sight. The rear sight sits high, and due to the angle of the stock, a cheek weld is not hard to obtain when using the rear sight. The rear sight's holder assembly is made of formed steel and seems to be coated with the same flat black finish as the receiver shroud. Note that the optic rail is polymer and not metal. The same can be stated about all rails. Some care should be taken to not over-tighten accessories. And speaking of accessories, Hi-Point offers rail-mounted accessories such as laser, light, magnified optic, or red dot sight and light and sight combinations. In my book, the Hi-Point 1095 TS is pretty flexible to many optics. And speaking of optics, you may have noticed the UTG 3-12x44 30mm compact scope, AO 36 color mil dot, mounted where the rear sight used to be. This is a perfect setup for me, as I suffer from astigmatism and a dot sight just does not work for me. I'm just a crosshair type of guy. The UTG 3-12x44 30mm compact scope may seem like overkill on a PCC of this nature due to its size and weight. However, the characteristics of the 10mm cartridge, with its increased velocity out of a 17.5-inch barrel, for example, 1,209 to 1,232 feet per second for Federal 180 grain Hydra shock, makes the round still effective at 100 yards, after which the bullet drops significantly, about -6 inches at 100 yards, where it begins to fall from the 8-inch MPBR window, and very effective at 50 yards, while delivering 476 foot-pounds of energy at 1,091 feet per second. To be the most accurate with the 1095 TS, I need a good magnified optic. While the scope takes care of my magnified needs, a GM Con green laser unit mounted on the underrail takes care of my other needs, like when using the scope is out of the question. The GM Con green laser unit is controlled by an ambidextrous switch, which makes it easy to turn on and off with the shooting finger of the support hand. It has a green dot with a circle, which is advantageous to shotgun operators. But with my astigmatism, a single dot is not a dot. But for some reason, when the dot is surrounded by a circle, it is a dot. Go figure. I show more about the laser when we go to the range. Now, let me show you each category that I will be presenting. First, I'll show you the tools and materials that I use to maintain the firearm. Next, I'll take you through the necessary safety check to ensure that the firearm is safe to work on. Then comes the procedures and steps for disassembling the firearm for cleaning and lubrication. I'll show you how I clean the firearm, what chemicals I use, and what I will show, what Hi-Point does not, what to lubricate, and what I use to do so. After cleaning and lubrication, I'll take you through the steps to properly assemble the firearm. Finally, I'll show you how I perform a function test of the firearm. So, let's get started by taking a look at the tools and materials you will need. You will need the Hi-Point tool or comparable tools, such as a small flat-tip screwdriver, a small nylon punch, a 5/16 inch box end wrench, nut driver, or socket, a 5/64 inch hex key or comparable for front sight removal if you decide to remove it, a small hammer, a laser or red dot sight for aligning the front sight if you removed it. You will need bore cleaning tools, such as a carbine length cleaning rod, a bore brush, a bore mop if you decide to use one, cleaning patch jag or holder, and a bore snake, which is optional. You will also need cleaning brushes, nylon and brass or bronze, cleaning patches, rags, etc., cleaning chemicals of your choice, lubricating oils of your choice, snap caps, this is optional but is something that I use, and blue thread locker, which is optional. This is for securing the operating handle bolt. Next, I'll take you through the necessary safety check to ensure that the firearm is safe to work on. To perform a safety check, first remove the magazine by pressing the magazine release button in. If the magazine does not fall out, then simply pull the magazine out of the grip and set it aside. Push the thumb safety fully downward to the off fire position. Note that the thumb safety must be in the off or fire position to allow the breech bolt to be removed when we get to disassembling the firearm. While holding the grip and with your finger off of the trigger and outside of the trigger guard, grasp the operating handle with your other hand and pull the operating handle fully back to eject any cartridge that may be in the chamber. Lock the breech bolt to the rear, the open position, by pushing the operating handle roller into the round opening in the receiver shroud slot until it locks in the open position. Once the breech bolt is locked to the rear, visually and physically inspect the chamber and the magazine well of the high-point carbine to be sure that no ammunition remains in either place. Once you are sure that the high-point carbine is unloaded, slowly release the breech bolt. Next, with the firearm pointed in a safe direction, pull the trigger to release the striker. Note that although it is possible to disassemble the firearm with the striker cocked, it is much easier to remove the breech bolt with the striker released. Alright, that completes the safety check portion. We now know that the firearm is safe and ready to be worked on. Okie dokie, my loins are girded and I'm ready for action. Nurse, I'm going in. Let's dig into disassembling the high point. Using the high point tool, a 5/16" box end wrench, or a socket, I'll remove the operating handle by unscrewing it from the breech bolt. Using the high point tool or a small flat tip screwdriver, I'll roll the rail lock fully up and back to unlock the fore-end cover. Now, I need to push or pull forward on the fore-end cover, lift it off, and set it aside. While pressing the shroud pins inward from the head side, I am rotating the shroud clips clockwise with the high point tool or a small nylon punch to unlock them. Using the screwdriver end of the high point tool or a pin punch, I push the shroud pins out of the receiver shroud and set them aside. Then I remove the receiver shroud assembly by lifting the front of the receiver shroud and pulling it off. Note that there is no need to remove the optic if one is mounted. I will begin removing the fire assembly by removing the receiver clip on the bottom side of the firearm with the high point tool or a pin punch by tapping it forward off the receiver lug with a small hammer. Now I'll remove the firing assembly by lifting up on the front of the barrel. To completely remove the breech bolt from the firing assembly, first remove the front sight by loosening the two set screws on the bottom of the front sight base with a 5/64 hex key. Set the front sight assembly aside. I'll talk about how to align the front sight later in the assembly procedure. In my case, however, I need to remove the flash suppressor, and I'm not going to bore you with that. With the front sight or other adapter removed from the muzzle end of the barrel, remove the barrel frame support by sliding it off the muzzle of the barrel. Set it aside for later installation. Using the high point tool or a flat screwdriver, I need to slide the breech bolt retainer clip back to release the breech bolt retainer. Next, I must push the breech bolt back approximately 3/8 of an inch to clear the striker from the barrel, and lift the back of the breech bolt up and over the barrel, sliding it to the front of the firearm. I must use caution here. The breech bolt is under spring tension from the main recoil spring, and the main recoil spring may fly out. Now, to slide the breech bolt out over the muzzle to completely remove the breech bolt. Then note that the breech bolt contains the retainer, striker, and springs, so I must be careful that they do not fall out. I must now pull the bolt retainer out of the back of the breech bolt, then turn the breech bolt upside down and allow the striker spring, striker assist spring, and striker to slide out the back. Next, I'll pull the main recoil spring forward and out of the frame. This completes the disassembly of the high-point carbine, at least as far as High-Point advises, and as far as I'm willing to take it. Never disassemble your high-point carbine further. Any further disassembly by an untrained person could cause your high-point carbine to malfunction and will void the warranty. Also, do not pull the trigger with the breech bolt removed. The sear is under spring tension and could fly out. This completes the disassembly of the high-point carbine, at least as far as High-Point advises, and as far as I'm willing to take it. With the high-point carbine disassembled, let me show you how I clean and lubricate the firearm. You may develop your own method later, but this procedure may help you get started. The more time that you spend with a firearm, the better you get to know it. Getting to know a firearm is not only important from an operational standpoint, but also from a maintenance point of view. A firearm will usually tell you what is going on with it, if you take the time to observe what it is telling you. So, where to start? There are a lot of parts to be cleaned. There has to be some sort of order to ensure that all parts are cleaned properly and completely before lubrication. I also need to touch on the safety aspect of cleaning. Always wear safety glasses when cleaning to protect your eyes from cleaning materials. Only use commercially available gun solvents and gun oils or a cleaner lubricant preservative. Use of improper cleaning fluids can damage your high-point carbine. The frame has a powder coat finish. Do not use acetones, gun scrubber, or harsh solvents that may remove the coating. Test new cleaning products on a small surface before using them. With that out of the way, I'm going to start with the barrel assembly, which also incorporates a whole host of parts. The first thing that I do is pre-soak the inside of the barrel. I use a quick grip clamping system that allows me to keep the barrel assembly, any barrel assembly, upright so that gravity and cleaning materials can do their jobs. I thoroughly soak the inside of the barrel with ballistol and then set the barrel assembly aside while I move on to cleaning other things, like all of the small parts. I just simply wipe down all of the small parts, like the firing pin and springs, or striker if you prefer, assembly pins, recoil spring and guide rod, receiver clip, etc. At this point, I inspect the firing pin to ensure it is still straight. I mentioned in my review of the High-Point 4595 TS that the firing pin can be bent due to several causes, but primarily due to the operator short-stroking the action when loading. You might notice that I use a magnetic tray to keep all the small parts from going wayward on me. This is just some insurance that I have to ensure that all the parts are together when I get ready to assemble the firearm. As the barrel assembly is soaking, I turn my attention to the breech bolt, which is a party in itself, since it houses the striker springs, and bolt retainer, and ejector keys that are actually the extractors. Using bronze and nylon brushes, patches, Q-tips, and cleaning patches, the breech bore is cleaned thoroughly and then set aside so that I can return my attention to the barrel assembly that has been soaking. There are a lot of nooks and crannies to clean in the barrel assembly that houses the trigger assembly, safety counterweight and counterweight pivot, sear, safety mechanism, etc., all of which I do not want to disturb, just clean. The bore is cleaned from the chamber end using Hoppy's number 9, bore mops, and judicious scrubbing. My last act of cleaning the bore is to run a bore stake with the tail end coated with ballistol. This firearm will not be shot again for quite a while, and I want to ensure that the bore is ready for storage. Wipe the outside of the magazine and the feed lips with a clean patch that has been slightly dampened with gun cleaning solvent or a cleaner lubricant preservative. Wipe the outside of the magazine and the feed lips with a clean patch and examine it. If it is not clean, repeat until the patch remains clean. Check the magazine to make sure the follower and lips are not damaged. Press down on the follower with your fingertip and release it to make sure that it springs back up and does not catch inside the magazine tube. Finally, and with everything cleaned to my satisfaction, it's time to move on to lubricating the firearm. High Point does not provide information about lubrication. Therefore, I'm going to make an attempt to highlight some of the areas of the 4595 TS that should be lubricated and which were determined by observing wear patterns as best I could. For lubricating the majority of my firearms, I normally use two choices of lubrication, ballistol and Wilson Combat Ultima Lube Oil. I apply both as sparingly as possible. Note that lubrication points and lubricants are my personal choices. Yours may differ. These are my choices of lubrication points. The face of the breech bolt at the firing pin channel. Only a light film is needed. The firing pin channel. I use ballistol and sparingly. High Point recommends a very light film of oil to assist the firing pin in its travel. Luckily, the firing pin channel is very easy to clean and the firing pin is loosely fitted. The surface of the slide that contacts the trigger bar. The surfaces where the sear cam and trigger bar contact. The sear pin that protrudes through the sear cam. I use ballistol at this point. Beneath the sear cam arm. The sear cam pivot point. The face of the sear where it contacts the firing pin. I also lubricate the counterweight pivot point. With the cleaning and lubrication completed, I think that it's time we move on to the next topic. Now that we have disassembled, cleaned, and lubricated the High Point carbine, just might be a good idea to put this thing back together. What do you say? Yeah, I think so too. I'll begin the assembly process by first installing the firing pin spring, and firing pin assist spring into the channel in the rear of the breech bolt. The breech bolt retainer is installed into the breech bolt by holding the cylindrical part and inserting the rounded part with the spring guide facing forward into the channel at the rear of the breech bolt. Install the recoil spring and guide rod into the frame by pushing them into the area of the frame below the barrel with the guide rod facing forward. Place the breech bolt with the retainer, springs, and firing pin over the barrel all the way to the recoil spring. With your finger off of the trigger, align the tab on the bottom of the breech bolt below the opening for the barrel with the end of the main spring guide and pull the breech bolt over the barrel. Continue to pull the breech bolt over the barrel, aligning the breech bolt retainer with the retainer hole in the frame. Note that when pulling the breech bolt over the barrel, be careful to pull it back far enough to clear the firing pin, if it is protruding from the breech face, to avoid bending the firing pin. While holding down on the breech bolt, make sure the retainer clip hole is aligned with the bottom of the retainer and push the breech bolt all the way down. With a nylon punch and hammer, push the retainer clip forward to lock the breech bolt retainer in place. Place the frame support over the muzzle end of the barrel and slide it back firmly onto the front lug of the firing assembly. Make sure that the retainer clip is properly locked through the slot in the breech bolt retainer and not under it. The firearm may still fire, but the breech bolt will not be properly locked in place, which could lead to serious personal injury and/or damage to the firearm. Install the firing assembly into the stock with the rear of the assembly first. Push the front of the firing assembly down into the stock so that the receiver lug protrudes through the bottom of the stock. Hold the stock and firing assembly with the bottom lug facing up. With the small bend facing away from the stock, place the receiver clip into the slots of the receiver lug. Then push it all the way over the lug until it is firmly seated. Note that using a nylon punch and hammer to seat the retainer clip works well. Install the receiver shroud back end first onto the stock, making sure that the shroud support plate goes inside the stock. Push the front of the receiver shroud down into place. Make sure that the shroud clips are rotated clockwise so that the large circular area of the slots is over the receiver shroud holes. Push the receiver shroud pins through the shroud, stock, and receiver until they protrude through the opening in the shroud clips. Pushing firmly on the head of the receiver shroud pins to compress the springs, use the back end of the high point tool to push the shroud clips counterclockwise and lock them into place onto the shroud pins. You can also use a small, non-marring nylon punch. Place the fore-end cover on the front of the stock over the barrel. Make sure the rail lock is in the open position. Align the mounting slots, push the fore-end cover down, and then slide the fore-end cover back under the top rail until it is seated all the way against the receiver shroud. Rotate the rail lock forward to lock the fore-end cover into place. Reinstall the front sight over the muzzle of the barrel and push it firmly into the front rail slot. Note that it may be necessary to slightly pull down on the front of the rail to slide the sight all the way back in. Sight down the barrel to align the front sight straight, and then tighten the two set screws firmly with a 5/64 hex key or equivalent. An alternative method to align the front sight is to use the rear sight. You may also use a red dot, laser, or even the scope set at a low magnification setting to align the front sight. If you desire, add a drop of blue thread locker to several of the operating handle threads. Install the operating handle and roller by screwing it into the side of the bolt through the left side in the receiver shroud. Tighten, but do not over-tighten the operating handle with the high point tool or a 5/16 inch equivalent tool. The assembly of the high point carbine is now complete. Well, it's back together. Everything's in place and there are no parts left over. I think assembly's complete. There is only one more thing to do until I can let you get back to what you were doing before you decided to stop in and spend some time with me. That's right, function testing. So, let's get to it. After assembling your high point carbine or remedying a malfunction, you should perform a function test to ensure that it is operating correctly, and I'm going to tell you just how to do that. Note that I use a snap cap to check functioning, which allows me to test for firing, extraction, and ejection. First, insert an unloaded magazine into the magazine well and make sure that it is noticeably locked into place. With the thumb safety fully down in the off or fire position, pull the operating handle back as far as it will go and release it to make sure that it is held in the open position by the internal breech bolt lock. Press the magazine release and make sure that the magazine can be easily removed from the magazine well. Leave the magazine out of the firearm. While holding the firearm, grasp the operating handle with your other hand. Pull the handle fully back and then release it to ensure that it returns to the fully forward position. Do this several times to make sure that it moves freely. Pull the operating handle to the full rearward position and push the handle roller into the round opening in the receiver shroud slot to manually lock open the bolt. Load a magazine with snap caps. I normally load 4 or 5 for testing purposes. Insert a snap cap loaded magazine into the magazine well and make sure that it is noticeably locked into place. Pull the charging handle fully to the rear, release it quickly, and ensure that the bolt goes fully forward and chambers the snap cap. With the thumb safety fully upward in the on, safe position, and the muzzle pointed in a safe direction, attempt to pull the trigger to ensure that the striker is not released. Move the thumb safety fully down to the off or fire position and pull the trigger to ensure that the striker is released. Pull the operating handle fully to the rear. The snap cap should be extracted and ejected. Perform this several times to ensure proper firing, extraction, and ejection. The bolt should lock back when all the snap caps have been ejected. This will complete function testing. Wow, man, we have covered a lot of ground during this presentation. First, we learned what tools and materials are needed to properly maintain the high point PCC. We obviously needed to know how to perform a proper safety check of the firearm. We also learned how to properly disassemble the Hi-Point PCC, and that it is necessary to perform deep cleaning of the firearm. In the cleaning and lubrication segment, you learned how I clean and properly lubricate the firearm. You will, no doubt, develop a technique that may differ from mine, and that is all right. The main point is that a properly cleaned and lubricated firearm will keep it ready when you are ready to use it. I think that we can all agree that properly assembling a firearm is tantamount to its operation. In the assembly segment, you learned how to do that. And finally, performing function checks ensure that not only is the firearm safe to operate, but that it is up to the rigors of sending projectiles downrange to the target. You probably have noted that I did not cover installing any options like magnified optics, red dots, or lasers and lights, or muzzle add-ons, just the basic firearm. The first thing that you may or may not notice is that a different optic was used for this range session. Failure of the initial optic to zero forced me to purchase a new optic at the range, the Sig Sauer Romeo MSR 1x20mm compact red dot sight. More on that later in the enhancements segment. I was shooting 6-round strings at a target 15 yards distant that allowed 2 Mozambique drills per string. I was in no hurry. I was working with a new carbine, a new trigger, and a new sight that I had quickly zeroed before filming. The operating handle on the Hi-Point carbine is on the left side, while the ejection port is on the right side. If you are a right-handed shooter, the operating handle will be coming back at your face at a pretty good clip when firing while ejecting shells way to your right. If you are a left-handed long gun shooter, as I am, what the charging handle does is no concern, because it is on the left side of the body. Spent shell ejection, however, is to the right, as it would be on most long guns set up for right-hand operation. As a left-handed operator, the angle of shell ejection and hot gases could be a concern. It is not pleasant to be hit in the face with hot brass or hot gas residue. Obviously, eye protection should always be worn when operating any firearm. For me, since I am a right-hand dominant left-side shooter of long guns, magazine changes are performed by rotating the top of the Hi-Point 1095 TS slightly outward from my body while holding the grip and pressing the firearm into my side. The trigger finger presses the magazine release button, while the strong hand strips the spent magazine out and feeds the fresh magazine into the magazine well. I have also found it easier for me to rotate the top of the firearm toward me until the operating handle is facing up slightly. Then, come over top with my working hand. In my case, this is my strong hand. Hold the charging handle slightly to the rear until I hear a click, the hold open lever being pulled down by the spring tension, and then quickly release the operating handle, trying not to ride the slide to release the bolt. The operating handle is not that easy to release regardless of the hand used. It is all a matter of knowing what the left and right hands need to do. The rubberized cheek rest has a rise to it at the front, and if my cheek is resting on that rise at the cheekbone, the sight is just at the right height for a very clear sight picture. Recoil is negligible, and the spring-loaded butt plate is actually doing something to contribute to buffering the small amount of felt recoil. The Hi-Point 1095 TS ran without a hitch. The trigger pull weight with a new sear spring really made the 1095 TS a bit more pleasurable to shoot. However, the trigger is still heavy and requires a bit more trigger finger than you may be used to. There is no just using the fingertip with this trigger. You need all of the trigger finger you can come up with. Thinking ahead and having experience with other high-point carbines, a dab of blue thread locker was used on the operating bolt handle to prevent it from loosening while shooting. All in all, a Hi-Point 1095 TS made for a great day at the range. If you will, allow me to summarize the enhancements made to the Hi-Point 1095 TS carbine. A razor muzzle brake from Hi-Point firearms was added to protect the muzzle and for aesthetic reasons. The front sight was removed as it was no longer needed with the magnified optic, and which resulted in a more streamlined look to the barrel. The forward rail was shortened for aesthetic reasons, as it was not going to be used. A green laser unit from GM Con was added for up-close and personal use of the firearm. A folding forward grip from Hi-Point adds more control to the firearm and protects the laser sight. A UTG 3-12 by 44 30mm compact scope was added for increased accuracy at distance. For quick target acquisition at medium and close distances, and in conjunction with the GM Con green laser unit, the scope was swapped out with a Tacticon Predator V2 reflex sight with 4 reticle patterns and adjustable red and green color settings. And finally, the sear spring was replaced for reduced trigger pull weight and increased control of the firearm. The Tacticon Predator V2 reflex sight failed to zero during the first range session. This sight was replaced with a 6-hour Romeo MSR 1x20 compact red dot sight, which was near zero when installed and quickly adjusted to a very near zero, good enough to complete the first range session. The GM Con green laser unit was uninstalled from in front of the vertical foregrip and installed just in front of the Romeo MSR sight to place it in the same focal plane as the sight. The Hi-Point 1095 TS is not a simple firearm. In the sighting system alone, there are 29 individual components. The firing assembly is comprised of 25 components, and the stock assembly consists of 47 individual components. Accessories for the Hi-Point 1095 TS are many, and most can be ordered with the Hi-Point 1095 TS. Check the Hi-Point website out for the many accessories. Hi-Point could have well opted to use formed aluminum for the receiver shroud, but did not, and the steel used is thicker than the receiver cover on my AK carbines. The polymer stock is mated together to form a complete unit and mates to the rest of the firearm very nicely. The buffered butt plate is a nice touch, and I would not mind having one on a few of my .308 rifles or even some shotguns. Granted that the Hi-Point 1095 TS has some foibles, but what firearm doesn't? Perhaps the finish could be better, the stock trigger could be a whole lot better, but that can be rectified, and I did just that, and the bolt could be a bit slicker operating. But the Hi-Point 1095 TS is what it is, an inexpensive 10mm pistol caliber carbine that is capable of putting bullets down range at a moderate distance with some degree of accuracy. For a firearm that can be purchased for less than $400, the Hi-Point 1095 TS could be used for home defense or personal defense. All in all, I think that the Hi-Point 1095 TS PCC is a good value for the money. Let's face it, a firearm's purpose is to send highly charged projectiles downrange, and I have found no evidence where a pretty firearm does this any better than an ugly one. Let's be honest, you don't need to spend a fortune on a handgun for protecting your home. A firearm used for defensive purposes should have several characteristics. It must be safe and completely reliable in operation. It should fire a cartridge powerful enough for the job at hand, and it should provide sufficient accuracy at the distances at which it is likely to be used. If it does that, it doesn't matter if it costs $100 or $1,000. Some may say my enhancements were excessive for a firearm that costs less than $400. I would answer that you are probably correct. But I now have a firearm personalized for me that has a better than stock trigger pull weight, a magnified optic that I can actually use, a laser pointer for educating the bad guy, and a different look to the firearm over the stock tactical look. So, for me and my needs, I figured that I did okay, and I am sticking a fork in this project as it is done. Well, I have come to the end of this review of the Hi-Point PCC carbine and 10mm. I appreciate you sticking with me. I hope that you will join me for other gun and gear reviews. Until then, stay safe out there.